In the shadows of history, in the spaces between what is officially recorded and what has been deliberately erased, there exists a bloodline so ancient, so powerful, so carefully guarded that entire empires have risen and fallen in service to its protection. This is not a bloodline of ordinary royalty, not a lineage of kings and queens who ruled through conquest and domination. This is a bloodline of consciousness itself, a lineage that carries within it the memory of divine wisdom, the knowledge of the sacred feminine, the understanding that true power is not the power to dominate others, but the power to awaken consciousness and to serve the evolution of humanity. This is the royal bloodline of the dragon, and at its heart lies a secret so profound that it has been hidden, distorted, and suppressed for nearly 2,000 years. This is the secret of Mary Magdalene. The story begins in a place that exists between myth and history, in a time when the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds were far more permeable than they are in our modern age. It begins with an understanding that Mary Magdalene was not simply a follower of Christ, not simply a woman who was healed of demons, not simply a witness to the resurrection. Mary Magdalene was far more than this. She was a priestess of the highest order, a keeper of ancient mysteries, a woman who carried within her consciousness the wisdom of the divine feminine that had been preserved through countless generations. According to the hidden records, the records that have been carefully preserved by those who understood the truth, Mary Magdalene came from a royal lineage, a family that had preserved the ancient knowledge since the time of Egypt, since the time of Lemuria, since the time before recorded history. Her family was not royal in the conventional sense, not rulers of nations or empires, but keepers of something far more precious, the knowledge of consciousness itself, the understanding of how human beings could awaken to their divine nature, the wisdom of how to align individual consciousness with the consciousness of the divine. Mary Magdalene's family was part of a secret order, an order that had existed in various forms throughout history, an order dedicated to the preservation and transmission of the sacred knowledge. This order had many names in different times and places, but it was always fundamentally the same, a community of initiates devoted to the awakening of consciousness and the service of humanity's spiritual evolution. When Mary Magdalene encountered Christ, something extraordinary happened. She recognized in him a consciousness that had achieved the full awakening that the ancient teachings pointed toward. She recognized that he was a living demonstration of what was possible when a human being fully aligned themselves with the divine consciousness. And she understood that she had been prepared her entire life for this meeting, that her role was to be his closest companion, his partner in the great work of awakening humanity. But the relationship between Christ and Mary Magdalene was far more than what the official Gospels suggest. It was not a relationship of a teacher and a devoted follower, though it was that as well. It was a sacred union, a union of the divine masculine and divine feminine principles, a union that created a field of consciousness so powerful that it could transform those who came into contact with it. Most importantly, Mary Magdalene bore a child, a daughter who carried within her the consciousness of both Christ and Mary Magdalene, a being who was born to continue the work of awakening that Christ had begun. This daughter was the first in a long line of descendants who would carry forward the royal bloodline of the dragon, who would preserve the knowledge and the consciousness that Christ and Mary Magdalene had embodied. The institutional church, when it discovered the existence of this bloodline, understood immediately that it represented a threat to its authority and its control. If it became known that Christ had a child, that there was a lineage of descendants who carried his consciousness and his wisdom, then the church's monopoly on spiritual authority would be broken. People would understand that the path to divine consciousness was not dependent on the church's mediation, but was available to all through the teachings and the example of those who carried the bloodline. And so the church launched a campaign of suppression that would last for nearly 2,000 years. It declared Mary Magdalene to be a prostitute and a sinner, transforming her from a priestess and a teacher into a symbol of shame and degradation. It erased all references to her true role and her true significance. It hunted down the descendants of the bloodline, forcing them to hide, to conceal their identity, to live in secret. But the bloodline could not be completely destroyed. It survived, hidden in plain sight, encoded in symbols and stories, preserved in the consciousness of those who understood the truth. The descendants of Mary Magdalene scattered across the world, some going to the south of France, some to Egypt, some to India, some to other remote locations where they could preserve the knowledge in safety. And in each generation, there were those who understood their role, who recognized that they carried a sacred responsibility, who worked to preserve and transmit the knowledge to the next generation. They became healers and teachers, artists and visionaries, mystics and philosophers. They worked from the shadows, influencing the course of history, guiding the evolution of human consciousness, always working toward the day when the truth could be fully revealed. The story of the recovery of this knowledge in the modern world begins with a historian named Thomas, a man who had spent his entire life researching the history of the Merovingian dynasty, the royal family that had ruled France in the early medieval period. Thomas had noticed something peculiar in the historical records, something that most scholars had overlooked or dismissed as insignificant. There were references scattered throughout the documents to a sacred bloodline, to a lineage that was said to be descended from Christ himself, to a family that was the keeper of ancient mysteries. Thomas began to research these references obsessively, tracing them back through the centuries, comparing them with other historical documents, looking for patterns and connections. And slowly, a picture began to emerge. A picture so extraordinary that at first Thomas thought he must be misinterpreting the evidence, that he must be seeing patterns that were not really there. But the more he researched, the more the evidence accumulated, the more certain he became that he had discovered something of immense historical and spiritual significance. The Merovingian dynasty, according to the hidden records, was indeed descended from Mary Magdalene and Christ. The royal family of France had carried within it the consciousness of the dragon bloodline, and this was the true source of their power and their significance. Thomas realized that this explained many things that had puzzled historians. It explained why the Merovingians had been so interested in preserving ancient knowledge, why they had gathered around them scholars and mystics, why they had been so concerned with the preservation of sacred texts and sacred objects. They were the keepers of the bloodline, the guardians of the knowledge that Christ and Mary Magdalene had entrusted to their descendants. But Thomas also realized that this knowledge had been deliberately hidden, that there were forces that had worked to suppress this information, that there were those who still had an interest in keeping the truth concealed. As he began to publish his findings, he encountered resistance from academic institutions, from the church, from sources that seemed to have access to information and resources far beyond what ordinary scholars possessed. He began to receive threats, both subtle and overt. His research was attacked and discredited. His books were suppressed. He was warned in various ways that he was treading on dangerous ground, that there were those who would go to great lengths to prevent the full revelation of this truth. But Thomas persisted. He understood that the suppression of this knowledge had been one of the greatest tragedies of human history, that the recovery and dissemination of this information was essential for the spiritual evolution of humanity. And so he continued his research, continued to gather evidence, continued to piece together the hidden history of the royal bloodline of the dragon. He discovered that there were still descendants of this bloodline living in the modern world, people who carried within them the consciousness and the knowledge of Mary Magdalene and Christ. People who understood their role in the great work of awakening that was unfolding. Some of them were public figures, some were hidden, but all of them were working in various ways to help bring about the revelation of the truth. One of these descendants was a woman named Isabella, a woman who lived in a remote location in the south of France, in a place that had been a center of the hidden tradition for centuries. Isabella was a healer and a teacher, a woman who worked with others to help them awaken to their divine nature, to help them understand that they too carried the consciousness of the divine within themselves. When Thomas finally made contact with Isabella after years of searching, he felt as though he had found the missing piece of the puzzle. Isabella confirmed everything that he had discovered through his research, and she revealed to him information that had not been recorded in any historical document, information that had been preserved only in the oral tradition of the bloodline. The royal bloodline of the dragon is not about genetic inheritance alone, Isabella told him. Yes, there is a genetic component, a physical lineage that can be traced back to Mary Magdalene and Christ. But the true bloodline is a bloodline of consciousness, a transmission of awareness that passes from teacher to student, from mother to child, from one generation to the next. It is the consciousness of Mary Magdalene herself, the wisdom of the divine feminine, the understanding that true power is not domination but service, not control but liberation. She taught Thomas the practices that had been preserved, showed him how to work with the energy of the dragon, how to awaken the consciousness that lay dormant within him, how to align himself with the divine will. And as Thomas practiced these techniques, he began to experience the truth of what Isabella was teaching, began to feel the transformation occurring within his own being. If you want a practical, step-by-step explanation of the path of knowledge we're exploring here today, I've created a complete guide to help you apply it in your own life. You'll find the link in the description. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. Thomas understood that the royal bloodline of the dragon was not meant to be a lineage of privilege and power in the conventional sense. It was meant to be a lineage of service, a lineage of those who had dedicated themselves to the awakening of consciousness and the service of humanity's spiritual evolution. And he understood that this bloodline was not limited to the biological descendants of Mary Magdalene and Christ. It was available to anyone who was willing to undertake the discipline and the practice, who was willing to awaken to their divine nature, who was willing to serve the great work of transformation that was unfolding. Thomas spent the final years of his life working to synthesize all of the knowledge he had gathered, to create a comprehensive account of the hidden history of the royal bloodline of the dragon. He wrote books that were published under various names. He created documentaries and videos. He trained other researchers who could carry forward the work, and he established networks of practitioners who were working together to awaken to their divine nature and to assist others in doing the same. When Thomas died, his work lived on. The knowledge of the royal bloodline began to spread, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. More and more people began to discover the truth about Mary Magdalene, to understand that she was not a prostitute or a sinner, but a priestess and a teacher, a woman of great power and wisdom whose role had been deliberately suppressed and distorted. And in our own time, we are witnessing a great awakening of this knowledge. The truth about Mary Magdalene is being revealed. The significance of the royal bloodline of the dragon is being recognized. And those who are ready to receive this knowledge, who are willing to understand that they too carry within them the potential for divine consciousness, are being called to step into their own power and their own purpose. The royal bloodline of the dragon is not about superiority or privilege. It is about responsibility, about the commitment to serve the awakening of consciousness in all beings. It is about the recognition that the divine feminine wisdom represented by Mary Magdalene is essential for the healing and transformation of the world. It is about the understanding that true power comes not from domination, but from the alignment of individual consciousness with the consciousness of the divine. Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute. She was a priestess, a teacher, a partner in the great work of Christ, a woman who carried within her the consciousness of the divine feminine in its most powerful and most transformative form, and her descendants, both biological and spiritual, continue to carry forward the work that she and Christ began nearly 2,000 years ago. The royal bloodline of the dragon is awakening in the consciousness of humanity. The truth about Mary Magdalene is being revealed, and those who are ready to receive this knowledge, who are willing to open their hearts and minds to the wisdom of the divine feminine, are being called to join in the great work of transformation that is reshaping human consciousness and human civilization. What they hid about Mary Magdalene is now being revealed. The truth is rising. The consciousness of the dragon is awakening. And you are invited to become part of this great awakening, to recognize the divine consciousness that flows through you, to understand that you too are part of the royal bloodline, not through genetics alone, but through your commitment to truth, to love, to the service of humanity's spiritual evolution. The secret has been kept for nearly 2,000 years, but secrets cannot remain hidden forever. The truth is emerging. The light is breaking through the darkness, and the world is being transformed by the revelation of what has been hidden, by the recognition of the true nature of Mary Magdalene, by the awakening of the consciousness that she and Christ embodied, and that continues to work through their descendants, and through all those who are willing to serve the great work of transformation. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.